Alright, so in this project we're going to be building an image carousel that will show a couple images, and it's going to basically just slide through them. It's going to do it on its own, but we also have these buttons here where we can control it. So I can go, next, next, and if it gets to the end, it just goes back to the beginning. So I can go next. I can also go back like that, and if we get to the beginning and click previous, it just goes to the end. Alright, so that's what we'll be building. Let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so we're going to get started on our image carousel. So I have my project starter open, and let's head to the title here and say image carousel. And down here we're going to have a div with a class of carousel that wraps around everything. And then inside here we'll have our image container. And I'm also going to give this an ID of imgs for images. And then you can just put image tags in here. It can be as many images as you want. I'm going to use 4 images from Unsplash. So these are just links to stock images, and then I just have first image, second, third, and fourth. These should probably be consistent. And then if I save that, you'll see we just have these large images. Now we do want previous and next buttons, so outside of the image container, which ends at this div, we still want to be within the carousel. Let's create a div with the class of buttons-container, and we'll have a button with an ID of left, and we'll say prev for the text, so previous, and then this one will be the next button, and we'll call this one right. So that should be it for the HTML. Pretty simple. Let's jump into our style sheet. And in the body here, we can keep most of this stuff. We don't need to display flex column or flex direction column. We don't need overflow hidden. We'll get rid of that. Let's see what else we want to do here. I think that's pretty much it as far as the body goes. So let's go down and let's do the class of carousel. So this wraps around all the images. I'm also going to just take the images themselves. And I want to first of all set the width and the height to 500 pixels. So let's change this to height, and then I just want to make sure that it looks right. So we're going to set object fit to cover. There we go. So now we have our images, we have our buttons down at the bottom. So for the carousel, which wraps around everything, I'm going to add a box shadow here. So box shadow takes in horizontal and vertical offset. I'm going to do 2 pixels for both, and then we'll do a 5 pixel blur and RGBA for the color, which will be black, so 0 for red, green, and blue. And then the alpha value, which is the level of transparency, will be 0.3. And then let's set I'm going to set the height here to 5. We'll do 530 pixels because it has to account for the buttons as well as the image. And then the width will be the width of the image, which is 500 pixels. Okay, and then I'm going to set overflow hidden so that nothing breaks out of the container. Now we can still see part of the second image here. So what we can do is take the image dash container. Okay, so image container, remember that wraps around all the images. I'm going to display that as a flex box. So what that did is it put these into a flex row, which is horizontal. Now we can only see one image because the image is 500 pixels wide, and so is the container. Now the way that this is going to work in terms of the carousel, the slider, is we're going to move the image along the x-axis using transform translate x. So what I'll do is set initially, let's set transform and then translate x, which basically means translating it, moving it along the x-axis, which is vertical. And we want to set that to an initial value of 0, which isn't going to change anything, but we want to set that initially, and then in the JavaScript we'll change this so that it can move the images over. So we'll move it over 500 pixels and get the next image in, if that makes sense. Now we don't want it to just flick right in. We want it to have a transition. So we want to make sure we add a transition property here, and I'm going to set a transition on the transform property that I just created. and then we'll do 0.5 seconds for the duration, and we'll do an ease in out effect. Okay, so that should be it for the image container. Now the buttons don't look too good, so let's go ahead and actually I'm going to move this. Let's move that up at the top here. We'll go under body. All right, and then for the button container, let's say buttons dash container, and all I'm going to do is display flex. So each button will be a flex item, and then I'm going to justify content, which aligns them on the main axis, which since it's a row, it's going to be on the horizontal axis. I want to do space between, because I want to take the space that is remaining here next to the flex items and put it in between the buttons. So if I save that, now it's going to put each button on each side, which is what I want. So now let's style the buttons themselves. So you know what, you can just grab it by button if you want, but I'm actually going to give these a class of BTN, just preference, set that to BTN. All right, and then we'll style .btn, and let's go ahead and set the background color, and I'm going to use Rebecca Purple for the background color, and then set the color to white, and let's get rid of the border, so border none. Okay, and then let's add some padding. I'm going to do 0.5 rem units. A rem unit is just a multiplier of the root HTML element, which by default is 16 pixels, so 16.5 would be 8 pixels. And you can use pixels if you want, just switching it up a little bit. So cursor pointer, and let's set the width to be almost half. Let's do 49.5%. Okay, so they take up almost half each. And then I just want to add to the hover, so btn colon hover, we'll just set opacity to 0.9, so it'll have a slight fade out effect when we hover over. And then let's get rid of any outline on the focus state, so button focus, we're going to set outline to none. Okay, so that's it for the CSS. Now obviously we want this to function. We want to be able to click next in preview. We also want it to go automatically, to slide automatically. So in the next video we'll get into the JavaScript to add that functionality. Okay, so now we're going to start on the functionality for this. Now if you have a decent experience with JavaScript and working with the DOM and all that, you can attempt to try this on your own. And in fact, I would encourage that for a lot of these projects. And if it doesn't match up to exactly what I have, that's absolutely fine, because there's so many different ways to do stuff like this. We're not working with a framework or something like that. I mean, when it comes to vanilla JavaScript, there's so many different ways to do the same thing. So let's start off by bringing in what we need. We have our images container, so I'm going to call this imgs. We'll get it by ID, so get element by ID. And if you remember, the image container also has an ID of images. So that's the same element right here. ID images is our image container that wraps around all of these images. So we also want to bring in our buttons. Let's do left btn and set that to document dot get element by ID, and that has an ID of left. And then we'll also get our right button, and we'll call this right button. And then we want to get each individual image as well. So let's say const, and we'll call this, we already have images, we'll just call this img, and it's going to be a node list, so we'll be able to do like img 0, img 1, and that'll get that specific index, just like an array. So we do that by fetching it with document.query selector all, because there's more than one. We want to get inside the images container each image. All right, next thing I'm going to do is set an index. So the index is going to be, where we're at. The first one will be whatever, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. It doesn't matter. You can put more images or less. Doesn't matter. We're going to start it at 0 and make sure you use let because we're going to reassign it. And then let's also create an interval because we're going to want this to keep running. So let's say set interval, and this takes in a function which I'm going to call run, and how often do we want to run it. I'm going to do 2000 milliseconds, which means 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds this function called run is going to run. And all this is going to do is increase the index or increment the index by 1, so idx++, and then we'll have a separate function to actually do the change image, and we'll call that change image. Okay, which we'll go ahead and create. So function change image. And really all this has to do is change the translate value. On the image container right here, you can see we have transform and then translate x, which is where it is on the x-axis, set to 0, which is going to by default put it in the first image. What we're going to want to do is slide it 500 pixels over to the next image, and then 500 pixels to the next image. And we want to use a negative value because we want this to go this way. If we do positive value, it'll go this way. And I can just show you right here. If I set this to -500, I probably should have showed you this earlier, that's automatically going to bring me to the next image. If we do -1000, next image. Okay. If we do +500, it's going to go the other way, which of course we don't want. So we want this to be at we want this to be at 0 for now. And before we even do the transform, though, let's check to see if we're at the beginning or if we're at the end, because then we'll have to reset the index to either 0 or the last image. So we can do that by setting an if statement here, and we'll say if the index is greater than the image dot length. Remember, image is a node list of all the images, so the length will give us exactly how many images there are. Now the thing with this is, actually I'm just going to console log real quick image, and let's go to our console here. So you can see it's a node list of 4 images, but the index is at 0, right? So it's 0, 1, 2, 3. So I want to see basically if we're at the end of the node list. Now image.length is going to give us 4 because there's 4 total. That's the length. But I want to see if the index is at 3, because remember the index starts at 0. It's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. So we don't want to check to see if it's greater than the length, because that's 4. We want to see if it's greater than the length -1, okay, which will be in our case 3. And if that's the case, then we just want to go back to the beginning, so we'll set index to 0. Okay, and then else, or else if, we want to check to see if we're at the beginning, so we can easily do that by saying if the index is going to be less than 0, then let's set the index to the end. And we can do that by setting it to the image.length, except remember the image length is 4, the last index is 3, so we just want to, again, -1 from that. Okay, once we figure out if it's at the beginning or the end, we can take the image container, which is images, and set the style dot transform, and we want to set that to some backticks, and then translate x, and in here let's open up our expression syntax, and remember we want to go negative whatever the current index is multiplied by 500, because it's 500 pixels. And make sure you put pixels outside of this right here, and it's just going to do what I just showed you when I put -500 pixels in here and -1000. It's just going to move the image, and it does it smoothly because of this transition. Without the transition, it would just flick to the next one. So let's just try that out. We'll save that, and now you'll see after 2 seconds the image changes on its own, and it goes back to the beginning when it hits the end. Now if we don't have a CSS transition here, if I comment that out, it'll still work, but it just flicks to the next image. So you want to have a transition so it's nice and smooth. And of course, you could change the duration if you want here for the transition. But yeah, I think that's good. So that handles, the automatic carousel. We also want these buttons to function, right? So let's go ahead and create some event listeners down here. Let's do left button. Actually, let's do right button first. So right button, we want to add an event listener. We're going to listen for a click. And on that click, we'll run a function. I'm going to use an arrow function. And since we're going right, we're going to want to decrement the index. So index minus minus. And then we can just call change image. All right, now I'm going to save this and click next. Now, you can see how we're having a little issue here because the interval is not resetting. It still has that same 2-second interval. And when I click next, it's not resetting it, it's not disturbing it. So it does some weird stuff. So what we can do is create a function right here, and we'll say reset interval. And there's a JavaScript function called clear interval, which will do just that. We want to clear the current interval, which we described above, and then just reset it. So we'll reset interval to set interval, and set it to run the run function in 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds. And then down here, right after we change the image, we'll call reset interval. We don't need this right here. All right. So now, if I click next, actually, wait a minute. This is going the wrong way. This should be plus plus. All right. Sorry about that, but you'll see even if I get rid of the reset interval, it still messes up because it's not resetting when I click on the button and switch the image. So you want to make sure that you reset that in order for this to work. All right, good. So now we want to do the same thing with the left button, which is going to be very similar. So I'll just copy that and we'll set this to left button, click, and all we need to do is minus minus. And now if I click prev, if we're at the beginning, it's going to take us to the end. See, it's going to go back and forth to the end. But if I keep clicking previous, I can go next, previous, next, next, previous. And you can add as many images as you want in the HTML. It doesn't matter if you have, 2 images or you have, 20 images. It doesn't matter. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Let's get rid of this console log here. And if you did try to do this on your own, if it doesn't look like this, that's fine. It might even be better than this. We're just trying to kind of simplify things for people that are fairly new to JavaScript. So that's it for this project, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let's move on to the next one.